The living shadows. It began slowly, almost too subtly to notice at first. At dusk, as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bathed in deep oranges and purples, the shadows in the small town of Calmore grew longer and darker. Some people thought nothing of it, chalked it up to the season, the way the days were getting shorter. But others, the more observant ones, couldn't help but feel uneasy. The darkness seemed thicker somehow, like the shadows had a life of their own, stretching just a bit too far, lingering just a bit too long. Sarah Halston was the first to notice something was off. She lived alone in an old, creaky house on the edge of town. Her days were spent working as a schoolteacher, and her nights were filled with quiet solitude. But lately, she had the unsettling feeling she was no longer alone. It started with small things. She would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of her eye, fleeting shadows where there should have been none. At first, she brushed it off as her mind playing tricks on her, the way the evening light could distort things. But as the days passed, the movement became more frequent, more deliberate. One evening, as she sat in her living room reading a book, she felt it again. A flicker of movement just outside her field of vision. She looked up, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows cast by the dim lamp seemed to sway, as though they were alive. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, and the movement stopped. "Just your imagination," she muttered to herself, trying to shake the unease creeping up her spine. But when she went to bed that night, her heart pounded in her chest, her ears straining to catch the slightest sound. The shadows in her room seemed thicker, darker, pressing in on her from all sides. She closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep, but the sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Sarah awoke to find a strange mark on the wall opposite her bed. A long, dark streak that hadn't been there the night before. It was as if something had dragged itself across the wall, leaving a smear of soot or ash in its wake. She frowned, rubbing at the mark with her hand, but it wouldn't come off. For the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping along the walls and floors like living creatures. Sarah became more paranoid, feeling their presence even during the day when the sun was high in the sky. She wasn't the only one. Across town, other people began reporting similar experiences. Joe Carter, the grizzled owner of the local hardware store, swore he saw the shadow of a person standing behind him in his shop, only to turn around and find no one there. Margaret Olson, an elderly woman who rarely left her house, told her neighbor that the shadows in her home had started breathing. As the days passed, the sense of dread in Calmore grew. The shadows seemed to have a mind of their own, moving with purpose, as though they were hunting something or someone. People began to avoid going out after dark, locking their doors and drawing their curtains tightly shut. But it didn't matter. The shadows found their way inside anyway. Sarah tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that there was a logical explanation for what was happening. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The shadows weren't just dark spots cast by the light. They were alive. They had taken on a life of their own, and they were hungry. One night, Sarah was jolted awake by a loud crash coming from the living room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, listening. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint creaking of the floorboards, as if something heavy was moving just beyond the door. She reached for her phone, but her hand froze halfway there. From the crack under her bedroom door, she saw it, a dark shape, shifting and writhing like a snake. It wasn't a shadow cast by the light. It was something else, something alive. Terror gripped her, and she backed up against the headboard, her mind racing. She had no idea what to do. The shadow beneath the door grew larger, darker, until it blotted out the faint light from the hallway entirely. It slid into her room, coiling along the walls, its inky form undulating as though it were searching for her. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. The temperature in the room dropped, and she could feel the cold presence of the shadow as it neared her. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but her body refused to move. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The shadow moved across the floor, slow and deliberate. It crawled up the side of her bed, creeping closer and closer until it was inches away from her. She could feel the coldness of it, a void that seemed to suck the warmth from the room, leaving her breath visible in the air. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow stopped. It hovered in the air above her, its amorphous form shifting and swirling. Sarah held her breath, her body trembling, waiting for whatever would come next. But the shadow didn't attack. Instead, it began to speak. The voice that emerged from the darkness was a low, guttural whisper, barely audible over the sound of Sarah's own racing heartbeat. "We are the forgotten," it hissed, "the forsaken. You cannot hide from us. You belong to the shadows now." Sarah's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the shadow seemed to drain all the strength from her body. It slithered closer, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She felt its cold touch against her skin, and for a moment, she thought she might die right then and there. But instead, the shadow pulled back, retreating from her body like a snake recoiling after a strike. It slid off the bed and retreated into the corner of the room, where it merged with the other shadows, becoming indistinguishable from the darkness. The next morning, Sarah found herself lying on the floor, drenched in sweat. Her heart was still pounding, and she could barely breathe. She looked around the room, expecting to see the shadow lurking in the corners, but there was nothing. The room was just as it had been before. But Sarah knew that the shadow wasn't gone. It was still there, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The following days were a blur of fear and paranoia. Sarah could feel the shadow's presence everywhere she went. It was in her house, in her car, even at work. No matter where she went, the darkness followed her, creeping closer and closer with each passing day. She wasn't the only one. The entire town of Calmore was in the grip of terror. People spoke in hushed whispers about the shadows, about how they were growing stronger, more aggressive. There were stories of people being attacked, of bodies found with strange, dark marks on their skin, marks that looked like they had been burned by the shadows themselves. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the town descended into chaos. People barricaded themselves in their homes, refusing to go out after dark. But it didn't matter. The shadows could get in anywhere. They could slip through the tiniest crack in a door, the smallest gap in a window. Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the shadows came for her again. She could feel them growing bolder, more powerful. The whispers in the darkness grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape," they said. "We are everywhere. We are eternal." One night, as Sarah sat alone in her living room, she heard the knocking again. This time, It was coming from the windows. She froze, her heart racing. The shadows were here. She could feel them pressing against the glass, trying to get in. She stood up, her legs trembling, and backed away from the windows. But it was too late. The shadows had already found their way inside. They moved across the floor, silent and deadly, their dark forms twisting and writhing like serpents. Sarah backed into the corner, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The shadows closed in around her, their cold touch wrapping around her body like a vice. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing she saw before the shadows consumed her was the inky blackness, closing in on her from all sides. The next morning, the people of Calmore awoke to find Sarah's house empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. But those who looked closely could see it, the dark smudge on the floor where Sarah had last stood. A smudge that looked suspiciously like a shadow. And as the days grew shorter and the nights darker, the shadows in Calmore grew bolder. They moved through the town like a living plague, claiming their victims one by one. And no matter how hard the townsfolk tried to fight them, the shadows always won in the end. For the shadows were alive. They were the forgotten, the forsaken, and they would never rest until they had consumed every last soul in Calmore. The town of Calmore was never heard from again.